Welcome to the November Agile Austin Product and AI SIG. We have three presenters today. Super cool. This is the first time we've had three. We've had two before, so this is a new record. We have Bankim, Tejani, Trenton, Nall, and David Neal here talking about security considerations for AI-driven products. Just a little bit about Agile Austin. There's a large organization. Both Vishal and I have been part of it since 2007 or 2008, depending on how you look at it. In Austin, and after COVID, we went virtual. I happen to be in Seattle today, so our meetings are recorded, made available on YouTube. So we have even a worldwide impact, but still are very tied closely to Austin. We have a board of directors, usually Max, our president, and Ben is typically here. I'm not sure if they're here yet, but they might show up. And there are sponsorship opportunities. We got to pay the bills somehow. And we've got a great group of sponsors and membership. There's benefits of voting and a few other things that you get for $35 a year. There are 6 different special interest groups right now. Between coaching, scale, book club, leader, SIG, and lean Kanban. This one is product and AI, and there's a little bit more about us. The meetup actually has more than 7,000 members on it, so lots of folks can contribute and learn here. Big thanks to a couple of our sponsors, Agile Velocity and ResumeX and Ad Maloria Coaching. Please, if you reach out to them for services, please let them know how you heard about them. We do have for members a professional development opportunity. Just reach out to Vishal or I, and we'll tell you a little bit about that. For all members, they can enter it into a raffle to win some professional development. Let's see, Agile Velocity has a QR code for 15% off public workshops. And we have lots of volunteers. Both Vishal and I are volunteers. I think Bankim has been a volunteer in some way, shape, or form over the past 10 or 15 years. So thank you to all the volunteers. And all it is we've got money to make programs happen, and it is 100% grassroots community led. So just reach out to contact at Agile Austin or Vishal or I. And there's just a little bit about Vishal and I. Been around for a while at Agile Austin, and we're really at we try to be at the intersection of product and AI and how those things work and how sometimes we need to consider things. And I think today's conversation will be a lot about how things that we want to consider, things that are security, ethics, a lot of these things are like, how do we understand what's going on with AI and make sure that we're considering everything when we're building these solutions. We do have a Slack channel. Reach out to me if you want to. Even though Slack is a member benefit, I've got an easement from the board to say if you came through the product and AI SIG that you get access to it. So we can continue the conversation there. We've got a couple of events coming up over the next 3 months. Hold off on December because I'm going to say something about December in a second. But interestingly enough, we're going to continue the conversation about risk management with AI in January with Elena Babkova. She's talking about generative AI and risk management and product design. She and I work together on some of our ISO certifications. She's helping us get secure and compliant in Europe with our AI solutions. I'm in product development myself. And then another great leader in Austin. She leads the Austin Women in Product. She's the leader of the Women in Product Austin chapter, Zuzana Sekharova, and she's also a product leader within a Austin startup company. She's going to be talking about AI enhanced leadership, clarity, accountability, and personalized growth. She just gave that at Product Camp 31 a couple of weeks ago. So we got a great set of programs. And in December, speaking about Susanna, this is the sponsored, this mega meetup is happening on December 3rd. It is an in-person event. In very small text, you can see the Agile Austin Product and AI SIG listed as one of the participants in this. I am going to paste the URL just in case you can't remember that very long number string. So please feel free to go to that. So we've got 4 events coming in the next 3 months, and we'd love to have folks that want to present. Just reach out to Vishal or I to talk about that. So here we are. building an AI-driven product or just using AI in general. Um, I talked to Bankim and I talked about this. I know he's part of OWASP, and we were talking about sort of the recommendations that are coming out of there for using it, for to respect data security and data privacy and all this kind of good stuff that's changing across the world, and it is changing. And there's really great use of this technology, but we want to think about the safe use of it too when we're using machine learning, AI, generative AI, LLMs, all that kind of good stuff. What's going on in neural networks? What's going on in Bayesian analysis? Like we got to think about security and privacy as well. So this talk from Trenton and Bankim and David will be talking about all of that. And I think instead of me introducing everybody, I'll let Bankim start and I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Matt. And let me share and switch over here. And you should be able to see that. Let me know if that
looks good
for y'all. I have to switch one window so I can see you. That would be helpful. Okay. So I'm Bankim. Tejani, as Matt said, we're friends and we've gone back in the past before. I've been a part for at one time, Agile Austin, I helped create a security SIG with Lee Fox some years ago, and we were doing a series of meetings around that. And I've also presented to Agile Austin. Probably I think the first time was maybe 10 or 12 years ago when Matt came in and chatted about stuff. So it was a great kind of segue into this. I also in this topic area, like I'm at the very front of learning as much as I can. And I had some guys on my team, David and Trenton, who have been really passionate and have taught me so much about some of the AI elements. And so I wanted to bring them along and help them introduce themselves to an audience that they probably don't see on a regular basis in product leaders and others in the community that are interested in this space, but are not necessarily day-to-day security people. Right. And so that's part of their growth and was part of my growth when I first got into Agile Austin, was to expand beyond being in the security community to being in a larger product and Agile community and bringing my skill set to that. And so I wanted to create that opportunity for them. Just to like kind of frame that, I've been in AppSec now for 17 years. I started my career in software development many years ago. And at present, we are all at HEB as part of the AppSec team. But we are not talking about HEB. We want to just disclosure that completely. We're not talking about HEB in what we're doing. This is all kind of personal and professional interest that we have in that. I also do some advising for small startups, which I started a year or two ago, and helping small companies that don't have a security team at all to kind of ramp up and start in security. And I'll let David and Trenton introduce themselves.
Howdy, nice to meet everyone. David Neal, been at HEB about 5 years, about 8 years in security. Super happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Trenton. I've been in security, I don't know, since the 8th grade. Started hacking, got in trouble with the principal. He said, let's redirect those skills and turn them into something productive. So I've been doing that ever since. So
today we're going to talk about a few different things, and we wanted to do was to really take more of a product lens of like how to help build a product and what do you need to consider for security when you're building a product with AI and in the space and what's there, rather than take more of like a compliance standpoint, a viewpoint around it. And it's also a little bit of like the philosophy of our team and structure. So Trent's going to talk about that a little bit here.
yeah, so you might have caught our first sort of image there. We had someone in the Austin Marathon with a pair of scissors and they were running around. And, we like using this metaphor, running with scissors, to talk about how to balance the trade-offs in security between productivity and delivering stuff and doing it safely. And we like that sort of metaphor because we think if you're doing it right, both sides are going to be a little bit uncomfortable. The people building the stuff, right, and the security people. And so we want to keep that balance. And, the same is true of AI. When you're building AI-driven products, you have to realize that, this is inherently risky. It's like running with scissors. And, there's really, it's not a one and done sort of thing. It requires ongoing vigilance, ongoing paying attention to, security standards and different things like that. And basically a process of, continuously navigating those different barriers. But we do think it's achievable, and you can see there are many, even consumer-facing, Fortune 500 companies today that are successfully launching, AI or LLM-driven apps, and doing so without, a lot of blowback or negative things happening so far. So it is achievable. And so what we're really talking about here, and we were talking about taking sort of as Bunker said, a product framing to this is, I think really that starts, when you're talking about security and privacy with empathy. And I think the key thing, if you're taking a long-term sort of perspective, about what sort of trade-offs you're trying to navigate is, the real question is, how can you maintain your customer and stakeholder trust over time? Right. And then realize that that's something that you have to wake up and earn every day. So that's how we want to frame it.
Yeah. And as one of my the CEO of Under Armour, when I first went to was at Under Armour, said, actually I think it was at South by Southwest when he did a keynote there. He said, trust is something you earn in drops and lose in buckets. Right. So that's part of that model of you have to earn it every day, and you earn a little bit from your customer every day, but one element can make you lose that, right? And that's what matters there. With that, like one of the things as we were preparing for this talk and thinking through is like the expectations are so different in different contexts. And rather than like just let that out there, we wanted to really help define that for you, in that there's two really high level contexts that matter, I think, in the current landscape today. The consumer context and the enterprise context. And what we're seeing around AI are very different expectations for security and control in those two contexts. There's many enterprises that are highly resistant to any kind of AI today, right? There's a lot of big businesses that, as they find out that their customers or their employees are using ChatGPT or an image generator AI, their first instinct is like, let's lock it down, right? Let's shut it down, to block it at the proxy level, or kind of say, hey, we can't do this, set a blanket policy that you're not allowed to do this. The same thing for code generation, and many other sorts of things. Whereas the consumer side, I think, exhibits a lot more curiosity about how these things work, until the point that privacy and security become suspect, and then consumers can act in a very similar manner if they feel like it's not trustworthy. So the behavior is very different between those two, but also the needs of them are different in that way. So data sensitivity is very different within those. The kinds of data that people are concerned with are often very different than the kinds of data that enterprises are concerned with. And that impacts how you want to approach setting up your program. And then likewise, regulated versus non-regulated spaces, right? So consumer space generally isn't regulated, but when you get into financial companies, insurance, health, those are areas where the companies have a very strict set of guidelines for how they can interact with customers, the kinds of communication they use, and they have to have more controls around that. So even something as simple as like, some AI that helps generate copy for social media tweets, or a chatbot that helps you get to the right area of the call center, right? Kind of like replacing your IVR journey with a chatbot, or some NLP to help you get to the right person. Like those are very regulated in the insurance, healthcare, and finance space, but less so in other spaces. And then, of course, when there's life or death at stake, that's going to require more scrutiny, more control for that. On the consumer side, the biggest kind of element that's there are the set of rights that have been set now for much of the world under GDPR initially, right? That this is the right to know where my data is, how it's being used, that you can't sell it without permission or without some sort of consent, right? That you can't use it without consent. That I can opt out of certain types of collection, and even tracking, but also that I have a right to ask a company what data they have about me and they've collected about me, and I have a right to receive that information in a timely manner, and I have a right to ask them to delete that data from their systems, right? So these are things that can be difficult to build in if you haven't considered some of those rights and some of those data flows in your product design. And so it's better to kind of bake some of those in, especially if you have a consumer-driven app at the beginning, because it's also just a lot cheaper to build those features in than it is to go retrofit them into a system that you've already built.
Kind of hitting on some of those enterprise concerns, if you think about LLMs today, and particularly, those frontier base models, they're extremely powerful and capable. And so, from an enterprise sort of frame, you have a technology that really has incredible potential, emergent capabilities, unknown capabilities. It's rapidly and continuously evolving. And so when you think about that, you think about it, just when an enterprise hires a vendor or buys any sort of product and then, uses that in a way that's going to materially impact their customers or impact their public reputation and things like that. They want to think about, how do I constrain and sort of get those predictable good outcomes that I want and avoid the bad stuff. And so some of the questions, that come up are, I think, typical as you would in other types of scenarios, like if I, mix this AI into my business processes. So if I have people coding and they're writing apps and they're using LLMs, how does that impact, copyright? How does it, impact other intellectual property sort of, things I want to preserve and stuff like that? Do I have control over my data? Are you training and like, is the provider training on my data? Could that be incorporated in future ways that I can't control or I wouldn't expect? So a lot of concerns around data and privacy. And so we're going to talk through kind of two, I think, really key things that we think really help, guide how to think about the basics of securing an AI-driven app, and that's tenancy and identity. And so what do we mean by strong tenancy? So, a lot of the risks from AI, and we've had this problem a long time in computer security, which is, there's sort of what you might call program or control sort of code. And then there's data, which is sort of, let's call it an inert set of facts. And then a lot of security vulnerabilities arise when, a computer or a person gets confused about those two things. And also when they're not clearly kept separate. And so when you're talking about AI, and you're building a new app or you're building a new enterprise system, we think what's really important is that you really pay attention to how you're separating the user's data, how you're at the architectural level, basically segmenting that up in a way where, the origin of data is basically clearly understood and tagged. You can manage its life cycle over time. So you can export that data, you can delete it. You can understand who owns it, because when you start having things like, LLM agents who are, taking autonomous actions, maybe you're building an app that, can generate slide presentations, how do you keep that AI agent from, accidentally or being abused such that it accesses someone else's data other than the person whose, presentation it's supposed to be building. And so really getting your architecture where that user data is clearly segmented from the start is super key. And the other thing we're talking about is strong identity. So, of course, when you're talking about, security boundaries and security controls, that really all starts with knowing who's interacting with your system. and how much basically credible belief you can have that it is in fact who you think it is. And so starting off with things like multi-factor authentication, going beyond passwords. We talked about, having that user data clearly segmented. Do you know when data comes into your system? Do you know who owns it, who contributed it? Can you control who can have access in the future? And then also thinking about how, whenever you're running a business, all these sort of exceptions occur. People lose their accounts, someone dies and, their spouse comes and asks for their data, or once an account shut down, all sorts of different scenarios that happen. And how are you going to handle those, and how will you prevent them from being abused?
I think one other thing I'd add on that step is, especially with authorization, like considering that, going back to like the context, the enterprise context or consumer, in strong identity, like one of the easiest things you can do if you're building a consumer app is do less, which is weird, right? But you could do less by integrating with Google, Microsoft, or Apple authentication and do single sign-on through those capabilities. And really, you're outsourcing a lot of the multi-factor, the authorization, right? Because they're going to authorize a lot of that stuff and some of the initial data collection. Like, it makes that a lot simpler, and it makes your product development easier because you don't have to worry about password brute forcing and a lot of like technical details that they're going to handle for you. And then for the enterprise, if you're in the enterprise context, the best thing you could do that I think more applications are doing now out of the box is do single sign-on integration for the enterprise for free for all of your tiers, right? It used to be that like if you're doing enterprise, they had to go to like a really high paid tier to get single sign-on integration. But you can reduce your complexity and security requirements by just doing that by default, right? And use some other set of features to drive your customers into higher paid tiers, but have single sign-on by default for your enterprise customers.
And so we're going to sort of walk through an example of how you might build an app. And, kind of like Bankim was saying, what we're hoping that people come away with is, if you actually implement all these necessary features to do data protection properly, for consumers or for enterprises, that's a very expensive engineering action. And so what we're going to talk about next is sort of a fictional app, and then talk a little bit about how you might build it and what sort of practical problems, security problems might arise. So here we're just thinking about, sort of a simple Spanish translation app. So people can come in, they can put English or Spanish and get a translation. They can also try to translate things themselves, and then get feedback from the AI to improve their language skills. And what we'll do first is kind of walk through how you might build that for the consumer market, and then how you can think about that architecture in a way where it'd be extensible to the enterprise. And so in this example, like Bankim was saying, is I think a clear thing is when you're building an app where you're gonna have a lot of, potential user data, AI agents interacting autonomously and things like that, it's really important that you choose secure building blocks and think about, basically the engineering investment that's going to be required if you choose to do everything yourself. And so what you really want to do is focus on the differentiated parts of your business, of your app, and then try to outsource all those other security details as much as possible to someone you can trust. And we don't have any affiliation, of course, with Google Firebase, but we'll use it as an example because I like what they've tried to offer, which is what you can do is they essentially have, services for all your core engineering functionality, a strong focus on giving you tools to, when user data comes in, to track its life cycle, making it very easy to delete and export data, making it easy to integrate with, logins and identities that people already have, whether that's Facebook or Google accounts, things like that. And then also providing a bunch of different services where you can just simply mix in things like moderation, security controls on AI outputs, prevent abuse and things like that, so that all those concerns can really be, an API that you call on the back end and don't have to be something that you need to implement from scratch. And so,
So our app is doing great with, we're doing it, Trenton, or?
go ahead.
So our app is doing great with Spanish translations, but there's another business opportunity here with additional languages that could be monetized as a multi-language pack for an additional cost. Even better though, we can use the same model for this feature. On the left side, we see a normal context. So the first bubble contains a system prompt, which instructs the model to translate only into Spanish. Below is the user prompt with the text to be translated, such as hello. And in our case, it responded with hola, which is expected. On the right side, we can see the same setup, but with a prompt injection attempt. The system prompt remains unchained, but the user prompt tries to trick the app into providing a French translation without paying for the multi-language pack in this case. So in this example, the user prompt requests French spelling of the word, where the model kind of fails to follow the instructions and instead provides the French translation of hello to the user. So as a result, there's no incentive for the user to pay for the higher subscription tier. It kind of negates the monetization attempt we're trying to achieve here. And next slide. All right, so here's a couple ways we can mitigate prompt injection in our application. So least privilege, as in not trusting your model with any excessive permissions, is going to help reduce the impact of any injections. Chat ML is a great feature. It's a markup language that separates the system and user prompts. This can help the model kind of detect if there's a prompt injection occurring and kind of be able to prevent that. So trust boundaries between the LLM and any external systems is going to help reduce the impact of any successful injections, where your case may include LLMs calling APIs, querying data, things like that. And then lastly, an external system to monitor this type of abuse is going to help. Taking it a step further, the data you collect on usage can help build your anomaly detection or even start adversarial robustness training.
Yeah, and I think I'll add just one thing on like trust boundaries. Initially, especially in your early stage of product launch, this is really just like logical and conceptual of how you think about your design. And then as your product gets more mature, that'll turn into code separation or data separation and other elements, right? But just having that thought process initially is what sets that trust boundary up to be successful. And then on the abuse side, especially in consumer systems, as your product grows, this is where privacy regulators and other consumer regulators, and there's increasing laws requiring you to monitor for things like harassment and hate speech, as well as discrimination or things like stalking. Like these are all things that are being codified as requirements for consumer applications and especially social consumer applications where there's interaction with consumers. And so there's and with AI, a lot of those regulators are looking to make sure that things like discrimination or hate speech or online defamation doesn't come back in responses that are or in generated content that's coming from LLMs and AIs.
Awesome. So now we're trying to grow our user base, and we decided third-party integrations are going to be the way to go. Unfortunately, though, after we go into production, we get alerts of cross-site scripting from sites that are using our embed code. So they're using our third-party integration. And the next slide. All right, so in this scenario, our integration is reading a site containing the indirect prompt injection. So it's telling the model to write JavaScript. So our model processes this and then returns the malicious code, similar to how like ChatGPT would respond to a request like this. The issue arises because our integration's front end isn't properly encoding or escaping the LLM's output. So this oversight leads to a cross-site scripting vulnerability in our integration, potentially allowing users to exfiltrate session cookies or just take control of the user's browser. And this is kind of what the attack chain looks like altogether. And this is called insecure output handling. And next slide. Cool. So some ways you can prevent this is going to be encoding the output from the LLM. Will help prevent the specific attack with malicious JavaScript or Markdown. And then you should assume that Any output from the LLM is untrusted input. So validation and sanitization is going to be a great idea. Treat it the same way you would treat untrusted regular user input, essentially. And then traditional AppSec and web security is going to help mitigate issues like this when they do happen, like content security policy, secure sessions, and then cross-origin resource sharing. Alrighty, we've collected a couple scenarios of AI going badly and some potential damages that could incur. So let's go over those quickly. So reputational damage can be a PR issue. We've all seen posts of memes on Reddit and Twitter of AI coming back with just crazy responses to things. And then fraud, denial of service, and then regulatory fines when things do happen. That's going to be a significant financial loss. And then, as we talked about, trust can be dumped in buckets in the event there's mishandling of sensitive data or just the general embarrassment. Alrighty. So there's some additional tax worth mentioning. Sensitive information disclosure. So generally assume that LLMs will share all of your secrets. So don't tell them any. So ways you can mitigate that is going to be removing PII and using tokenization where possible. And then system prompt leakage is also a risk. So generally try to avoid any confidential information in the system prompts, and then don't trust the system prompts to kind of control your LLM behavior. So don't try and prompt engineer the LLM to be better at keeping secrets. It's just generally not what they're very good at. And then also is unbound consumption. So we don't want someone calculating their PhD thesis on particle physics with our app if it's a Spanish translation. So rate limiting, timeouts, and throttling would help prevent cases of unbound consumption. And we got some more specific examples here. So Slack had a case of data exfiltration where a user in a public channel could take potentially sensitive information out of private conversations and use the models to kind of flow them into the public area. Bing had an instance of chat prompt linking, and then there was a case of cross-site scripting in ChatSonic, similar to what we saw with the Spanish app.
I think, like, I'll pause there for a second. Have you guys experienced any failures or remember any stories and of seeing those besides these, right? I mean, we can try to give a few examples, but I know all of you are in the product space for it. Like, what are the ones that are of concern to you that you've seen?
I'm trying to unmuting folks.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to unmute, I'm going through and you can all unmute if you want to.
Like, I think one that's been very interesting over the last couple of years is people using content generated from ChatGPT or other generative AIs. Like, I think there's been a few examples of lawyers that have used like AI generated briefs and submitted them to court and then had them either be not factual or misrepresented. And so they've, like, I think at least one or two cases, lawyers have been chastised by the judge for this. I don't know if anyone's gone to like contempt of court fines or jail, but there's been enough cases where like that's an area that's important. I know that a lot of engineering leaders and software development leaders are concerned about defects from AI generated code, and so that trade-off is something that's there because it can make your developers more productive, but you also want to be mindful that you're not introducing an unknown defect. You have good test cases around that to take advantage of it. So those are, depending on the nature of the business problem that you want to solve with your AI-driven solution, you want to think of like what are ways that my customer can go wrong with this solution, and how can I prevent that, or how can I coach them to a better set of outcomes, or in some cases insulate you as the product builder from the risk that your customer might take.
Yeah, I guess I would say running local open source models locally has opened my eyes up to just how much money is being thrown into the pit of AI safety across companies. So, because pretty much any open source model, you can just get it into the hallucination stage pretty quickly. And so I think a lot of money is being spent across OpenAI, Microsoft, Facebook, to put guardrails around that. And so even today, I can still find small ways through the moats that they've tried to put up around the hallucinations. So I think that to your point, as you're developing products, is still a major, major challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
What, just to go back to I remember seeing was it like a car dealership, and the car dealership support line would allow you to, I think there were two things, and maybe this was two incidents. The first one was you could just start using it unfettered like this as like chat GPT. You didn't have to, they clearly hadn't done anything to prevent them from, like, it was supposed to be for support, but you could ask anything and it would give you all the answers back. And I think it was
Right.
GPT. The other thing, maybe it was the same thing but closely related, was people did a deal and they got confirmation of buying a car at free or nearly free or a very low price, and they tried to execute on that. And I don't think they actually were serious about it, but
Right.
it was like caused, I think you were talking about like sort of the
Yeah.
embarrassment, right? It's like,
Yeah. 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 Which, it reminds me of, and I'm amazed because I'm old, but like in the early days of online shopping, right? Like you could do things to like do price manipulation on the browser with cookies. And some of those transactions went through, but eventually people were like, nah, we're just not going to allow this anymore, right? And so there's a set of like a little bit of cat and mouse, but also understanding the boundaries of what's successful, not successful, what people are going to try and not try, with that, right? Like the idea that like your chatbot for the dealership is really meant to, in some ways, replace a set of IVR prompts or something else to get you to like parts department or service or to this advisor or that advisor. And they never really thought of somebody using that thing to like, ask what the weather is, right? Like that's not what was in scope. And so having those testing and thought boundaries and all of that is really important to being successful with it.
Yeah, and hopefully part of what's coming off from, these examples that David gave is just how complicated it is. And really the point we want to make there is not that you shouldn't go build stuff with LLMs, because you should. It's a fantastic technology that's revolutionary. It's that, think about what your building blocks are. How are you putting it together? And think about how you can constrain the context in which the LLMs or the AI operates. What does it have access to? What can it do? And how can you really define those inputs and outputs clearly and make sure that that's the context of what it can do?
Yeah.
and it's interesting because it's not super significantly different. I shouldn't say super, too many adjectives, but like it's very similar to the way that we've done testing in the security space around, injecting data, whether it's on, a URL or even a form field where you like, buffer overflows and things like that. It's just, it's sort of like, yes, it's new and it's awesome, and it's still kind of the same thing too. So patterns models that we've used before are
Yeah.
absolutely useful.
Well, I think it goes to like patterns are still good, patterns are still patterns, and anti-patterns are still bad anti-patterns with AI, right? Like they don't change. If you use anti-patterns when you build an AI product, you're going to end up with the same kinds of problems that you did with other systems.
Right.
One of the things when we were putting together this talk, we looked at like the OWASP LLM top 10 and generative AI, and what we kind of saw was so much of it was tilted around the corporate, like regulated corporations consuming AI context. And that really wasn't as relevant to like, how do you build something new and ship a new product that you want to build with it, right? But what is relevant to that is all the rest of the OWASP patterns and anti-patterns, right? Like all the rest of stuff still matters. It's just, how you use it in this context and And that, goes back to understand your customer, understand what they're going to do with the product, and then try to safeguard that in a way that makes sense to them and for you.
And I really like that point to Bunkum about think about it from the empathy, trust perspective of, is someone going to look back retrospectively on the actions you took and the way you developed your product and what due diligence you did and judge that you acted in a way that, reasonably regarded their interests. And that's really the question. I think in many ways too, that's going to be the legal question if things go really bad as well, that'll be applied. Because we don't really have a lot of case law and a lot of laws and stuff on the book that really define, the parameters of this stuff. So act reasonably and responsibly.
Yeah. So this part we looked at, kind of, okay, what if we've already built a product? What should you do, right? You didn't have a chance to do some of these steps that we talked about. So what should you do to kind of bootstrap and catch up? One, make sure you've already talked to a lawyer, but also your customers, right? What are the expectations your customers have? What obligations do you have? Most sites nowadays use, even when you're launching a fresh startup, like you grab a terms of service or terms of use from a template from somewhere else. But have an attorney, make sure you take a look at that and stay on top of those things. Privacy policy, same thing. They're all pretty readily available, but you want to make sure it applies in context to the value you're providing your customer and what your customer wants from your site. If you haven't done it already, get a security test, right? Some sort of penetration test or offensive security test, or get a security advisor that can help you to go through that, right? Find gaps that would make it trivial, that can arise with some of these things that we've talked about. Another thing, especially with AI and open source, consider a responsible disclosure program, which is, that's the more formal way to describe a bug bounty program. And you may not actually even have to provide a bounty, like lots of dollars, like it could be $5. It could be very small. Many responsible disclosure programs actually don't have any reward. Sometimes they just give you free access to the app or something like that. There's lots of really curious security professionals that will give you feedback because they care about security, and they'll give you feedback on what you can do to make yours better. And as long as you engage with them in a professional manner, they'll keep doing it, right? What you don't want is that professional that's looking at it reach out to you, you ignore them, they get frustrated, and then they decide to publish about your site without you ever being involved. And that's really what a responsible disclosure program is gives them a meaningful channel to talk with you, and that you get a chance to talk with them before they publish. And that gives you a chance to kind of fix things and maybe publish together, which can highlight the value of your interest in you protecting your customers' data. There's lots of OWASP cheat sheets and guides. And as we were talking about before, like a lot of the other OWASP practices, patterns, anti-patterns are all still really applicable. And so there's a lot of resources there that you can look at that is a great starting point. And then got a bunch of links to help with that, which we can share as part of the docs. I won't go through all of them, but there's a bunch of other places that are there. OWASP has some Gen AI stuff as well. Again, we found that to be very kind of enterprise corporate lens and a little bit less consumer product lens, or a lot less consumer product lens. So depending on what kind of application you're building or want to build, you might want to consider those. Some additional AI products and more things to learn. So I won't go through all of those, but you just open up for questions and discussion, and you get all the links with the slides. Matt, do you post the slides as well with the video? PDF or
No.
something?
Typically, I'm trying to figure out how we would do that. We can do a URL in our Slack channel. The other thing is we put it on YouTube, and if I have the URL, then I could just put it as a comment within that
Okay,
YouTube.
cool.
Yeah. So yeah, you've sent that over to me, Bankim, so I'll make sure it gets in both of those places. Correct me, Ben, does that sound right to you?
Sounds right to me.
Okay, cool, thanks. And I'm gonna take since the folks that are here are probably not Zoom bombers at this point. But now everybody has the ability to unmute themselves. Yeah, I think that's good. So if you want to ask questions of our wonderful presenters here, please feel free to come off mute.
Did we get the chat questions answered, do you think?
Yeah, is it Sentin? Did that some of those guides that Bankim shared answer your question? I'll just restate the question. It says, it sounds like we need a template of questions to ask ourselves, dev teams and stakeholders in terms of security by phase of project. Is that simply too unwieldy, spaghetti-ish?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Let me see if I can pull up the chat because I can't quite see the question.
I think you were going through, Bunkum, you were going through, or the folks were going through kind of things to consider when you're building these things and the ways that, and then we were talking about all the different kinds of prompt injection, buffer overflow kind of things. And, is there like sort of a simple list of questions to get us started? I think it's probably, oh, and Sen is off mute now.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, you sound good.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a project manager type. So I just think basically in terms of phases, like we're getting ready to build it, we're building it, it's out there. And like how not to be done at each of those phases and what questions. So I think all those things you put up there is good. You scan through it and you say, what questions do I need to ask myself about all this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think like more than a template, because the challenge with security templates is they get really unwieldy over time.
Yes.
You could get to infinity.
Yes.
I think a really good place to start first is ask the questions of what are the top things that your customer wants to do with your product, and then from that invert each one to say, what do you not want them to do with the product, right? And that can help you just sort of distill what are some of the high level boundaries, what you want to protect, or like what would be a negative outcome if they use this the wrong way in those stages. And then that can give you a set of scope to start with and think about how would you want to prevent that, and how would you want to help keep good guardrails to help them achieve the positive outcomes, and think through that a little bit. And that's a little harder. There's a ton of security checklists, like OWASP has a ton, that OWASP cheat sheet has a ton. There's a lot of different options there, but you could die by 1,000 cuts by looking at all the different security checklists that are available. I think if you start with that customer first, what do they want to do, and then what it would be the worst outcome for your customer, that gives you a really good starting point of how you could contain that, and then go from there.
I like the way you put that scope. That's a scoping exercise, and that takes care of infinity.
Yeah. And then once you have that, then it's a lot easier also, because then you have a much more specific problem of how do I prevent this? And then there's a ton of resources that you can look at to like focus on preventing that particular set of things.
Yeah.
Instead of the nebulous, like, how do I prevent bad things? Because that's really nebulous and can get really sideways quickly and derail your positive momentum in building features that you want to sell, or that you want your customers to love.
Thank you.
Sorry, I came in a little late, so if y'all covered this, I'm kind of interested in kind of the concept of just normal products and testing of the use of essentially golden data sets. In other words, I put an input into a system and I have an expected output, and that always stays the same run after run after run, which in this case is probably a lot less likely. So do y'all have any guidance or thoughts on how test data sets might be used in deployment pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to like simplicity, right? Like most test data sets are valid data options, right, that you want to be successful and you expect a certain outcome. So I think the first starting point is find some boundary points at which a failure should happen, right? So like, simplistically, like, if an integer that's coming in and you expect it to be a positive integer, right? Like, well, test -1, test 0, right? Test infinity or something that like is the boundary of your int32, depending on what that is, right? Like the same kind of principle would apply to your other inputs, right? So if you're expecting a phone number, test, something that's not a valid phone number, but still numbers, and see how your code reacts to that. And as you expand upon that, then that'll give you better clarity. And then there's a whole field around fuzzing, which is really of how can you introduce entropy into that input testing process, right? And usually to achieve a security outcome or a security failure, but you can use the same thing for QA and for quality and building. And like empirically, what we find when we look over, 20 to 40 years of software development is higher quality code tends to be more secure code because of these same dynamics, right? Because higher quality code tends to have better input quality, better validation of input, and then that helps enforce that boundary between input and command, which is the real, pivot point of so many different injection attacks.
And to kind of talk about more, one of the things we hit on earlier was basically thinking about how to isolate the context. Like if you're inserting an LLM in your app, how to isolate the context of that, looking at the inputs and outputs and how you can constrain its potential behavior, because then you can test those constraints rather than trying to test the model. And so we do know that, of course, you can have an LLM model, they have temperature settings, and so you can make them deterministic, but then you lose a lot of the utility of having the model, which is, being able to have emergent complex behaviors. But yeah, I would just encourage thinking about the context of the LLM and testing that, because that'll potentially be easier. I think one other thing to consider is using LLMs and AIs to test, evaluate, and sort of do abuse detection on other LLMs. So having a watcher, watching the primary LLM in the app is a key strategy that most of the moderation tools and many of the security evaluators are using.
Excellent. Yeah. Go
To
ahead.
me, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just saying, yeah, thanks. That all makes sense. I hadn't even thought about the LLM validating an LLM.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about sort of the kind of going back to the patterns and things don't change as much. One of the, if you look at a well-architected, AWS or Azure, or one of the first things we talk about is cost optimization and budgets, and like the use of budgets and alerting on expense, or in this case perhaps tokens, which are probably, if you're seeing some sort of anomalous behavior, that could also be a good, like, we got a system, it's there, it's running, and oh my gosh, why are our tokens or our budget, why is our bill going really high? And that could also be another way of a bit of a canary of usage too, or excessive or abusive usage, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and one thing David mentioned was like rate limiting and throttling, right?
Yeah.
That's another place where you can really leverage the cost optimization as well, right? Because for
Right.
most applications, there's a small percentage of your users that are doing a high majority of your operational costs in terms of transaction volume, even for consumer services, right? You always have your power users.
Right.
And so having rate limits or metrics for rate limits isn't just valuable, like we think of it from the abuse context, right? Like helping to identify abuse, but it's actually just as valuable from a profitability standpoint, because you can find out, okay, which customers are costing me the most? How do I invest in converting them to a paid model? Or, if I set a rate limit in a certain way, will that put them over the hump to sign up for a paid subscription? In a more rapid, acceleration than if I just let them continue at the free tier where they're costing me more money, right? And so like that's more of a product like strategy, but the way that you instrument your security, your quality, your performance optimization can be used as that feedback loop in your revenue model.
Well, we're at in Austin, it's about 4 o'clock right now. Any other last questions before we let our excellent presenters go for the day and the weekend?
Thank you.
All right. David, Trenton, and Bankim, thank you so much for your contribution to the community today. We'll make this available on YouTube. And for folks that are curious about the Agile Awesome product and AI SIG, just let me know, or Vishal know about that you're interested in joining the Slack community. It's free. And we'll see you there, or we'll see you. We're taking December off from the product and AI SIG, but we're doing the in-person meetup with the other product groups in the mega meetup on December 3rd. And then in January, we'll have our next meeting. And finally, if you're interested in presenting, you like what you heard here, or want to talk more, just let us know. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks.